Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Lauren. I have a private practice and I'm also a UK educator with Vitae. I specialise in sort of female hormonal conditions. And obviously, because our kind of hormonal systems are so complicated, a huge part of that is related to stress and the HPA axis. So I really enjoy talking about stress and anxiety. So tonight we're going to talk about, we're basically going to go through like a few kind of definitions, the sort of pathology of stress. We're going to look at acute and chronic stress, the kind of symptoms that clients will get, testing, and then some kind of nutritional, supplementary, and lifestyle recommendations for stress and anxiety conditions. So that's not only, you know, chronic fatigue, hypoadrenal function, like adrenal fatigue, but also anxiety, depression, and any sort of mood disorders as well. So I always like to, before kind of diving into pathologies, I like to think about what the sort of the healthiest or the healthiest state that the body wants to be in. So in terms of stress, yes, there can be some benefits to having stress in your life. So we'll talk about eustress and how your body obviously it's exposed to stresses on a daily basis. So having a sort of robust HPA axis is really important. But the majority of the time your body wants to remain in homeostasis and sort of equilibrium, and any stresses will take you away from that, and your body obviously wants to kind of go back to that base level of normal as quickly as possible. So this can be caused by any external disturbances and also internal. So obviously external is could be temperature differences, diet, exposure to toxins, chemicals, but also internal disturbances like any kind of glucose dysregulation and stress. Obviously stress is external as well, which then causes an imbalance, and your body will quickly try and get it into a state of balance ASAP. Now, the World Health Organization defines stress as the physiological reactions that, as a whole, prepare the organism for action. So a lot of the symptoms that are associated with acute stress in particular are related to improving your heart rate, improving your cardiovascular function, so your cells are more oxygenated and your muscles are more, you know, able to get you to move out of the stressful situation. And it's an activation of the sympathetic part of the nervous system, so fight or flight, and also the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which we're going to talk about in quite a lot of detail. So the body needs an adequate hormonal response to survive risky situations, but inadequate activation of autonomic functions or adrenocortical overload can be harmful to health and survival. So let's just look at some of the hormones and neurotransmitters that are involved in stress. So the immediate effect, so when you're going through a stressful experience and you have that kind of jolt to the heart, or, you know, your heart skips a beat, that's epinephrine and norepinephrine, or adrenaline and noradrenaline. And this is, I'm going to admit a few people as we're going through. They need to come in. And so this is an immediate effect, and these are released within seconds, so 2 to 3 seconds. In a more intermediate effect, it's the same hormones, but these are now released from the adrenal medulla rather than the nervous system, and this takes about 20 to 30 seconds. And then on a more prolonged basis, it's the collection of other stress hormones, so cortisol, adrenocorticotropic hormone, vasopressin, and the rest of them that are associated, like aldosterone, etc. It takes about 10 minutes for your body to produce and release cortisol, and it takes longer for it to be broken down. So this is more hours rather than within seconds, which is the case with epinephrine and norepinephrine. So if we now move on to this flow diagram, which sort of nicely shows the stressor, and then you've got the anterior hypothalamus, so the front of your hypothalamus, which then releases corticotropin releasing factor, which then stimulates your pituitary gland to produce adrenocorticotropic hormone, which then feeds into the adrenal gland, and then the adrenal gland produces both corticosteroids and catecholamines. So the corticosteroids are more associated with longer term or chronic stress, whereas the catecholamines, again, this is your kind of instant acute stress response. And this is just a cross section of the adrenal gland. So it's separated into two main areas. You've got the medulla, the very center, and then 3 layers of the cortex around the outside. And as I'm sure you all know, the adrenal gland is sort of like a walnut-sized gland which sits on top of the kidneys, and you've got 2 of them. And they are sort of in your kind of upper middle back. And so the medulla produces the catecholamines, so the epinephrine and norepinephrine, as well as the nervous system, and also peptides. So it produces 2. One is called somatostatin, and this is a growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So it's actually associated in, I think it's Cushing's disease, which is where you have an overproduction of adrenal hormones. Some of the symptoms are related to kind of tissue growth, so like having a kind of moon face, like a particular shape to your face and neck, that is caused by the overproduction of somatostatin. And then substance P is associated with the sensation of pain. Now, in the cortex, we have the androgens, so testosterone and DHEA, and also estrogen that are produced. We've got cortisol and the inactive form of cortisol, cortisone, which are produced, and then the mineral corticoids, which are aldosterone and corticosterone. So aldosterone is involved in the salt-water balance. So it causes the kidneys to retain sodium ions, which then causes the retention of water, which increases your blood volume and increases your blood pressure overall. Corticosterone is a similar hormone to cortisol. It's actually mainly found in rodents. So in any studies that are related to animal studies, they will look at corticosterone, but humans produce some of it, and it has similar effects to cortisol. So in terms of the acute stressor, so this is the effects of the catecholamines. So we've got the stressor, the external stressor, whatever it is. The hypothalamus then sends nerve impulses via the pituitary to the adrenal gland, and then the adrenal gland produces adrenaline and noradrenaline. These are released into the blood vessel, which causes an increase in heart rate, an increase in blood pressure and volume, an increase in blood sugar, so blood glucose, and this is via a number of pathways. So the liver converts our storage of glucose, glycogen, into glucose. There's also an element of gluconeogenesis, so fats and proteins are used to produce glucose rather than carbohydrates, and in some cases that can actually come from our muscle and bone tissues, and also the dilation of bronchioles in the respiratory system. So adrenaline and noradrenaline, although they sound like they should be like the kind of opposite of each other, they actually both work in very similar ways. And it's just a difference in the receptors that they affect. So they both, there are receptors in the cardiovascular system for both of them. So both of them increase heart rate, and they also increase blood sugar. But it's adrenaline that affects the receptors in the respiratory system, and then obviously increases the oxygen capacity to improve breathing. But then the norepinephrine is also responsible for increasing blood pressure. So they both work together. So in terms of the stress response, so obviously there are some systems that will be upregulated, and these are the ones that are essential to our immediate survival. So that's respiratory, circulatory, and musculoskeletal. And then the ones that are deemed as unessential, they will be deactivated because it's an unnecessary use of our energy. So that involves the immune system, reproductive system, and digestive systems. So when we look at aldosterone, obviously this increases water retention to increase blood volume and blood pressure. Cortisol, as we've said, gluconeogenesis and also mobilization of glucose from our glycogen stores in our liver. So basically getting that blood sugar up as quickly as possible. Now, obviously over time, this can lead to chronically high levels of blood glucose and also insulin resistance or dysregulation, type 2 diabetes, abdominal weight gain, you know, the classic kind of weight around the middle, which suggests people are under a lot of stress and holding that weight in the kind of, the middle area, and metabolic syndrome. I think a lot of clients don't realize that they could have an incredibly healthy diet and they think that, you know, their blood sugar is regulated, totally regulated, but actually it's, you know, being chronically stressed is exactly the same as having, you know, sugar 24/7, because your body is ramping up that like blood sugar level. And because cortisol is a catabolic hormone, so it's a breaking down hormone, then we can also get protein catabolism from our muscles and also our bones. And then there's a complex relationship with our immune system with cortisol, which we will talk about a little bit later in more detail. But overall, the effects are thought to decrease our Th1 mediated immunity, so our T helper 1 cells. And this is the kind of part of the immune system, of the adaptive immune system, that involves fighting viruses and cancer cells and intracellular bacteria. So a decrease in this means an increase in Th2, which is our more kind of allergic and allergenic side of the immune system. So not only will you potentially be more exposed to viruses and potentially a higher risk of cancer, but also you would have an increased expression of Th2. So you might suffer from more kind of allergenic conditions like hay fever and food intolerances. And then we've got adrenaline and noradrenaline, which we talked about, so increasing heart rate, blood pressure, and enlarging pupils. I think somebody has come off mute. If it would be okay if everybody muted, so we don't have any reverb and background noise, that would be great. Okay, so our stress response can be broken down into short-term and long-term. So short-term stress response is adrenaline, noradrenaline, and this is primarily our essential systems that are important for survival. And then long-term is associated with cortisol and the mineral corticoids, and this is the other systems, so immune system, digestive, and reproductive, that are more likely to be dysregulated. So I like this diagram here, which breaks the two of them down. So if we're looking at acute stress, again, acute stress can be beneficial, and it's you know, a normal part of everyday life. and it is temporary, hopefully. So the hormones that are involved are adrenaline and noradrenaline. Adrenaline is the fight or flight hormone. Some people get confused with and think that's cortisol, but cortisol is more associated with longer term stress, and it's called the stress hormone or the death hormone. So the adrenaline and noradrenaline are produced via the sympathetic adrenal medullary system. So it's via the nervous system, and this also involves the adrenal glands. And it's an acute stress response. The metaphor is an injection. The hormones are quickly broken down, and it mainly affects the cardiovascular system. Whereas cortisol is a chronic stress response. Your body has a long-term capacity to produce these hormones, and it affects a number of different systems, including the immune system, and keeps the body in high alert. So the metaphor is like a dripping tap. This state can be maintained for a long period of time. So cortisol, takes about 10 minutes to be produced, and it lasts much longer before it's broken down, unlike adrenaline and noradrenaline. So when we talk about adrenal fatigue or HPA axis dysfunction or hypoadrenal function, then we are talking primarily about cortisol and DHEA. And so on the right hand side, we've got a healthy diurnal cortisol cycle. So over 24 hours, your cortisol will be highest at about 3 in the morning. And then when you wake, you'll have a temporary cortisol awakening response, which is like a little peak, which is a kind of 50% increase about half an hour after you've woken up. And then throughout the day, it decreases, and it's at its lowest level at about 10 to 12 p.m. before bed. Now, if there's any form of HPA axis dysfunction, then obviously this normal cortisol cycle will be affected. So the graph on the left-hand side here displays a kind of typical progression into, I mean, at the end here we've got failure, but this is that it's sort of unusual to get to that state, and doesn't tend to happen unless there's an element of autoimmunity via Addison's disease. However, just talking through the stages, so stage 1 is the alarm stage, and this is the very high stress stage, and this is where cortisol tends to be high, and DHEA could be normal or lowering. The resistance stage is the next stage. So this is as cortisol is on its way down, lowering, but it can be seen as normal, and the DHEA is low and continuing to decrease. And then the third stage is exhaustion. So this is when cortisol is low and DHEA is low. So most salivary index testing now includes DHEA, and it's important to look at DHEA because if, for example, a client is in stage 2, so the resistance stage, which can last, you know, a kind of variable amount of time, then you need to be able to know the DHEA amount because the cortisol may appear normal. Now, each of these stages is variable in its kind of time scale, and I feel as though there's a bit of kind of variation in terms of how robust somebody's health is and just how good their constitution is in general. So some people may have a kind of typically kind of weak constitution and progress quite quickly, whereas other people may be in the resistance stage for decades if they have a particularly stressful life, stressful job, and it becomes their kind of new normal. There are a number of, as we talk later on in the presentation, adaptogens that can kind of prolong this resistance stage, which can kind of prop you up for as long as possible for you to kind of maintain your normal routine. But obviously at the same time, you've got to also be working on the source of the stressor to ensure that you don't kind of progress further. And also just to note, so in terms of adrenal fatigue, it's not the actual adrenal glands that become fatigued. It's actually the communication between your hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal glands. So it's not that it's more that your brain kind of down regulates the production of cortisol due to an increase in the stressor, or rather continuation of the stressor. So looking at the biological and physiological responses, obviously we've gone through a lot of these symptoms, but they can be really, really varied. If somebody is having, panic attacks, anxiety attacks, this is a fight or flight sort of reaction. So this, the ones on the left-hand side here are more associated with that. So obviously the heart rate, pounding heart, palpitations, chest pain, lots of flushing, and temperature dysregulation, feeling faint, and then, obviously sweating. And then as we progress, these are kind of more like long-term symptoms. Because your body is down-regulating any non-essential systems, including the digestive system, our digestive juices are down-regulated. The production of those are down-regulated. So this is why when people are particularly stressed, they might have dry mouth, dry throat, choking feeling. Some people even have issues swallowing, like the kind of dysphagia, like they can't. There's a dysfunction in the swallowing ability, and obviously not digesting well. Lots and lots of digestive symptoms, very varied. So pain, cramping, nausea, diarrhea, constipation, and also an increase in urination, and that's related to the aldosterone increase. And I always like to talk about emotions when it comes to any kind of stress or anxiety, because I think a lot of people, when you're talking to a client and you're talking about stress is such an everybody's stressed, but it's such a kind of general term now. All of these emotional responses are classed as stress. So loneliness, guilt, shame, forgetfulness, obviously depression, sadness, anger, they're all expressions of stress, and your kind of emotional response is just as valid as a physical response, I feel. So moving on to the kind of longer term consequences. So this infographic is mainly relating to the action of cortisol. So cortisol is a catabolic hormone, so it breaks things down, whereas DHEA is an anabolic hormone, so it builds things up. So if you have high cortisol and low DHEA, you've sort of got a double whammy in terms of breaking down tissues. So some symptoms of this could be muscle loss, so sarcopenia. Bone loss is a big one. So if somebody has the thing is with bone loss is that it's a silent thing. Unless somebody is older or going through the menopause or breaks a bone, it's usually something that people don't really pick up on, but it can be quite insidious, and it's definitely something to be aware of. If somebody mentions that they kind of fracture their bones quite easily, or they're getting bone or joint pain. So cortisol indirectly acts on bone by blocking calcium absorption, which decreases bone cell growth, as well as catabolizing the breakdown of bone for gluconeogenesis, so production of glucose. What else do we have on here? So collagen loss as well, so advanced aging, so particularly affecting the skin. The thyroid, so the relationship between stress and cortisol and the thyroid is quite complex, but as an overview, very high cortisol can increase the production of reverse T3, which can block the ability of the active thyroid hormone to to work, and it hinders the conversion of T4 to T3, both directly and also indirectly, because it does burn through mineral stores, high cortisol. And it also suppresses TSH, so it can look artificially low on blood tests, even when your body isn't getting enough thyroid hormone. So if you're looking at a thyroid panel, then it's always best to get a kind of as comprehensive blood test as possible. And it can exist with or without autoimmunity. Autoimmunity in general, again, the immune system is kind of complex when it comes to cortisol, but high cortisol suppresses the Th1 part of the adaptive immune system, which is the more pro-inflammatory, whereas Th2 is thought of as more anti-inflammatory in general. So this is why steroids like prednisone and other steroids for inflammatory conditions are given, because they tend to be anti-inflammatory. And also high cortisol is less associated with organ-specific autoimmune conditions, because this is Th1, and more with Th2 dominant autoimmune conditions like full body ones like lupus. And as we said before, also more associated with seasonal allergies, asthma, and potentially an increased risk in cancer. But obviously that's very controversial. This is sort of more like theoretical. In terms of the hormonal effects of high cortisol, so with women, they have a more complex hormonal system, and so cortisol can really wreak havoc. And hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is where a woman doesn't have periods for 6 months or more, often coincides with very high stress, also under eating and over exercising, but stress can play a big role, and also worsening any kind of hormonal condition. So maybe PMS or PMDD will worsen, periods will be irregular, and PCOS symptoms will worsen. But it's not great long term. So let's skip on to this. So this is an overview of the kind of hormonal pathways in the body. So this is obviously from Dutch test, and just to give you an overview of how cortisol is produced. So at the top here, the top left, we've got cholesterol, and which is the beginning of all steroid hormones are used with created with a backbone of cholesterol. And then we've got the master hormone, which is pregnenolone, which then gets converted into 17-hydroxypregnenolone, or it goes via progesterone, 17-hydroxyprogesterone, and then to cortisol. And then obviously there is a reversible reaction between cortisol and cortisone. Now, high cortisol is not related to a progesterone or pregnenolone steal. So it's not as though you have progesterone and then it gets taken and created into cortisol. Yes, it does affect, high cortisol affects women's hormonal systems, but not in that way necessarily. So the way that a cell will make a hormone is that it pulls cholesterol into the mitochondria of the cell, and then will go through this pathway to make whatever the hormone is, rather than stealing it from another mitochondria. The reason why high cortisol affects progesterone production is quite a complex cascade, but high cortisol, or also adrenaline or noradrenaline, will increase the aromatase enzyme in the brain. So an aromatase promoter in the brain increases the aromatase enzyme, which converts testosterone to estrogen. High estrogen then suppresses gonadotropin releasing hormone in the brain, which means that the pituitary can't produce healthy levels of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, which are the two hormones that control ovulation. So basically, high cortisol suppresses ovulation, but it's via the brain rather than via stealing progesterone. And then obviously if ovulation is prevented or delayed, then you won't produce progesterone because you don't have the egg leaving the ovary and the corpus luteum producing progesterone. So that's the way that high cortisol can cause hormonal dysregulation, specifically in women. So in terms of testing, so adrenal stress testing tends to be done via saliva now. You can obviously have urine and blood tests. These tend to be less sensitive. Now there is the dried urine test, which is the Dutch test, which we will go through a little bit later, and that has been shown to be quite similar to the adrenal salivary test in terms of the curve that it shows throughout the day. So most practitioners tend to use one of those two. And they measure cortisol and DHEA primarily. Adrenaline and noradrenaline are broken down so quickly, and you wouldn't really be interested in them, because if somebody's exhibiting chronic stress symptoms, then you want to look at cortisol and DHEA. So the stress index tends to look at 4 saliva samples or 5 collected at specific times over a 24-hour period. Obviously, we've talked about this. So the symptoms of high cortisol tend to be insomnia, trouble with sleeping, anxiety, sugar cravings, feeling tired and wired, increased belly fat, metabolic syndrome, and potentially bone loss. Whereas low cortisol, the main symptom is, intense, persistent fatigue and low energy. And then also, similar sugar cravings, poor exercise tolerance, and low immune reserves. So for the salivary testing, obviously there are lots of advantages. It's quite convenient in terms of, you don't need to go and get blood drawn, and it's done within 1 day. Now, the samples have to be frozen, so if somebody doesn't have a freezer at work, then that's quite difficult, because you want somebody to obviously have a kind of typically normal day, so you get an accurate view of their stress levels rather than a relaxed day when they're at home. But most of the time, people can make that work. So here we have a graph comparing the urinary free cortisol and salivary cortisol. So some people will choose to do the dried urine test. The only thing with this is that you can't measure the cortisol awakening response. So Dutch do offer a salivary test as well as the dried urine test. And this is just taken between half an hour to an hour after you've woken up to catch that little cortisol awakening bump in your cortisol graph, which we'll actually talk about a little bit later on. So they're both quite similar. And so this is the cortisol awakening response. Now, actually, just a quick note about cortisone. So cortisone is the inactive form of cortisol. It's converted by an enzyme. Some tissues will deactivate cortisone to protect the mineral corticoid receptors in that area. And some tissues, like fat tissue, will preferentially convert back to the active cortisol. So it's a kind of bi-directional conversion between the two of them. So yes, the cortisol awakening response. So this is basically, obviously you've woken up, your kind of highest levels of cortisol were at 3 a.m. in the morning, and it's kind of a gradual sort of decrease from there. But there is a temporary bump around half an hour after you've woken up. About 25% of people don't mount CAR, and that's normal genetically. There's nothing wrong with them. So you may have absolutely nothing. And it's worth, bearing that in mind. But the rest of, the 75%, the rest of the people, about 50% increase in cortisol is expected and healthy. So I've got a few notes here about this. So An elevated cortisol awakening response can be adaptive as a reflection of anticipation for daily stress. So if here on the blue line, if it's particularly high, then it's likely that the person is chronically stressed. So they have been trained, or their brain has been trained, that life is incredibly stressful, and as soon as they wake up, they're immediately snapped into this high cortisol state. And it's associated with anxiety, an overreactive HPA axis, any kind of job-related stress, you know, like thinking of before they wake for the day, it's like anticipatory stress. And it can also be associated with pain. So waking with painful joints, for example, or waking with a migraine or a headache, typically pain on waking, you know, people tend to experience pain towards the end of the day as their cortisol levels are lower, but pain on waking is an indication that their CAR is too high and dysregulated. And then if it's blunted, so here we've got the green line, this is seen in clinical burnout, and a lot of sort of mental health conditions, so PTSD, depression, seasonal affective disorder, and sleep apnea. Now, even though a patient may have, or a client might have, normal free cortisol levels throughout the day, so they might have a normal curve, if they have a dysregulated CAR, that still gives you quite a lot of information in terms of whether their cortisol response is appropriate. So we can also measure secretory IgA. So IgA is an immunoglobulin, which is an antibody playing a role in mucosal immunity. And it's the most common immunoglobulin that the body provides. So it provides protection against pathogenic microbes, and it's the first line of defense. Now, deficiency of secretory IgA is quite common, and it typically shows whether if somebody is in a high stress state, or they have been in the past, then it shows to what extent the immune system is implicated or affected by this. It also shows or indicates issues with the digestive system. So if they have any gastrointestinal or even respiratory issues, because these are the kind of mucosal membranes that secretory IgA would usually protect. So secretory IgA is produced by the B plasma cells of the adaptive immune system, and it binds to pathogens such as bacteria, yeast, viruses, and food proteins in the mucosal lining of the gut. And the production of that is affected by stress, and also inflammation, you know, any digestive conditions, but particularly now we're looking at chronic stress. The low levels of secretory IgA are linked with high levels of stress caused by high cortisol. So this could result in inadequate production of secretory IgA in response to a mucosal infection, and reduced IgA levels may be associated with suboptimal adrenal output, in which case it's best to also do an adrenal stress test. It's also, so low secretory IgA also indicates an increased sensitivity to foods, because secretory IgA tags foods as acceptable. So if you have insufficient amounts of this in your digestive system, then it may be likely that you will have issues with food intolerances and food sensitivities. So the epidemiology of anxiety and depression. So over 300 million people are estimated to have depression, equivalent to 4.4% of the world's population. I'm surprised it's not higher, actually. But it's continually increasing. And the number of people living with anxiety disorders in the world is equivalent to 3.6% of the world's population. So looking at depression, The main neurotransmitters involved are norepinephrine, serotonin, acetylcholine, dopamine, and GABA. And it tends to be more common in women than it does in men. Men actually have half the reported rate of anxiety disorders of women as women do, and it's thought to be partially due to the role of testosterone in levels of anxiety. So low levels of testosterone are associated with higher anxiety, and vice versa. And administration of testosterone has been shown to reduce socially fearful, avoidant, or submissive behavior. So that's interesting to be aware of. Obviously, there's an increased risk of alcohol dependence with any with many mental health conditions, and there may be an increased incidence of attention deficit hyperactivity in children of sufferers of depression. And then when it comes to anxiety, there are a number of different anxiety disorders, but generalized anxiety disorder is defined as anxiety and excessive worry. Okay, so I'm not going to go through these in too much detail because I want to get to the good stuff at the end when we're talking about like supplements, adaptogens, and other nutrients that can help with stress. But in general, we've got some anti-stress strategies, which I'm sure, I mean, these are the first things that any kind of nutritionist or healthcare practitioner would recommend. So cortisol already increases your blood sugar and causes glycemic dysregulation. So in the same way that I tell clients, if you start your day in sugar, you'll end your day in sugar. So don't have, you know, like a really sugary breakfast, sugary cereal. If you start your day on stress, with high stress, then you'll end your day with high stress, because throughout the day, it's this constant, you know, yo-yoing of blood glucose. And if it increases faster, it falls faster. So any stimulants that may increase this blood glucose, like caffeine, sugar, alcohol, and recreational drugs, which most I feel as though a lot of kind of practitioners and clients may like shy away from this, but that's really important. So remove those first ASAP and support balanced blood sugar, because that the dysregulation in blood sugar can cause a lot of the chronic conditions related to stress. Because it's also a catabolic hormone, I think it's important to make sure that the person is having regular balanced meals. So in an ideal world, if people had very kind of robust and balanced blood sugar levels, then they should be able to go, you know, like 3 or 4 hours without eating. I think in somebody who's chronically stressed, it's important to kind of give them, you know, protein, fat, fiber on a regular basis throughout the day. So a really important nutrient is tryptophan, and this is a building block for serotonin and melatonin. Obviously, tryptophan is an amino acid, so low protein diets can reduce tryptophan levels and our ability to produce these, but also tryptophan and a lot of the other amino acids are better absorbed when they're paired with carbohydrate. And so cutting out protein or carbohydrates is a bad idea when it comes to somebody who's chronically stressed. You want obviously the good carbs, you know, refined carbohydrates aren't great, but if somebody's having, you know, potatoes or no potatoes, then I would always say go for the potatoes and have the, you know, a source of protein, source of fat, and potentially something higher fiber with it rather than nothing at all. Also important for women who are of childbearing age, because they need a certain amount of starch in order to ovulate, and if they don't get that, then they could potentially have issues with ovulation. Now, obviously omega-3 fatty acids, they're amazing for all the conditions. And the ideal form of these is from oily fish or from a fish oil supplement or an algae omega supplement. and DHEA is the main structural component. So it's actually 98% of the structural fat in the brain is DHEA, and the dry weight of the brain is 60% fat. So yeah, so a high DHEA supplement is great. Algae omega is actually higher in DHEA than fish oil anyway. So if somebody's vegan, then that's a good option. And of course, you know, large-scale clinical trials have shown that fish oil can alleviate depression. Although in terms of depression, it's EPA rather than DHA that improves symptoms, or so it's thought. Now, in terms of nutrients, obviously vitamin C and adrenal gland health are like very kind of closely linked. And ascorbate is actually needed for the conversion of cholesterol into pregnenolone. So not just cortisol hormone production, but all hormone production, vitamin C is really important for. And during any kind of stress, so internal stress, emotional stress, physical stress, the urinary excretion of vitamin C is increased. And as a double whammy, stress can also increase the requirement for vitamin C to maintain normal blood levels. So stress depletes it and you increase your requirement for it. So basically vitamin C is really essential for anybody who is stressed. And not just, I mean, in the diet, it's great because you get all of those phytonutrients and bioflavonoids that are help with the absorption, but also a good quality supplement has shown to help people experience less fright and show a faster recovery of cortisol levels, indicating that the adrenal glands are functioning better. So then we can move on to the B vitamins. So a lot of people have like plentiful B vitamins in their diet, but with stress, it can increase your requirement for B vitamins. And then we also have to bear in mind that some people have the MTHFR genetic mutation, which means that they might need a methylated form of B vitamins. So maybe they would have to take a supplement or have a higher intake of B vitamins in their diet. Vitamin B5 or pantothenic acid is particularly important for adrenal gland function. And this is because it's actually a building block of coenzyme A, which is needed to create cortisol in the adrenal cortex. So studies have shown that a deficiency in pantothenic acid results in adrenal atrophy. And obviously the symptoms are very similar to adrenal fatigue. So fatigue, headache, sleep disturbances, and nausea. In terms of supplementation, obviously B vitamins are water soluble, and some of the recommendations for supplementation for pantothenic acid can be quite high. So up into, you know, like grams a day, so 2 to 3 grams a day, spread out throughout the day. And then, so we've got folic acid or folate, which is believed to relieve stress, anxiety, panic, and depression. And there's a relationship between deficiencies in folic acid or folate and mental illness. I think there's a link between depression. Now, it's not mentioned on this slide, but vitamin B6 deficiency is also identified as a predictor of increased overall psychological stress. And somebody who has low vitamin B6 and low zinc due to having maybe a high level of pyrroles, cryptopyrroles in their blood. So genetically they might produce more of this, which binds to vitamin B6 and zinc. The symptoms of this disorder are depression, fatigue, confusion, poor mood, in addition to a number of other conditions. So symptoms, sorry. So yeah, B6 is another important one. B vitamins, I mean the complex in general, is really important for stress. Magnesium, of course, nature's relaxant. It's an agonist of GABA receptors. So GABA is our chief inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. And so magnesium increases the action of GABA, which produces anti-anxiety, calming, relaxing effects. And magnesium is also an antagonist of NMDA, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter, a bit like glutamate. So it's kind of a double whammy of increasing the inhibitory one and decreasing the excitatory one. So you have an overall calming, a calming effect. Low magnesium is also associated with low testosterone. So as we were talking about before, low testosterone can also increase anxiety and symptoms relating to anxiety. And those with anxiety and depression tend to have lower magnesium levels in studies. In terms of supplementation with magnesium, bisglycinate is great because it's bound to glycine, which again is a relaxing amino acid. It can really help with sleep. And then we've got selenium. So obviously selenium is an antioxidant, and deficiencies of selenium have been shown to have a negative effect on adrenal function. Adequate supply of vitamin E increases the effectiveness of selenium, and low selenium has been shown to be associated with depression. Zinc is another big one. So as I was saying before, with pyrroles, if somebody has genetically a higher production of pyrroles or cryptopyrroles, then these will bind with zinc and B6 and cause the excretion of these nutrients, and the symptoms are severe anxiety and depression. So, and also like a number of other things, sensitivity to light and noise, poor dream recall. So yeah, so zinc is very important in terms of anxiety and also depression. So studies have shown that zinc is inversely correlated with depressive states. Okay, so coenzyme Q10. We're going to talk about this in a bit more detail later on, but so CoQ10 contributes to the generation of more than 90% of the energy in the body. And this is because it's essential in the process of cellular respiration. So it's involved in the production of ATP, cellular energy, and it's also a really powerful antioxidant. So it prevents oxidative stress, particularly when it comes to maintaining the health of blood vessels and heart muscle. So any kind of cardiovascular health. Studies have shown that in people with hypoadrenal function, CoQ10 levels were low, and CoQ10 is also low in drug-resistant depressive states and in chronic fatigue syndrome. So this is the kind of nutrient that you would maybe put into a protocol for somebody who has low cortisol or hypoadrenal function, rather than somebody who's in their high cortisol states. Because obviously it's going to boost your kind of cardiovascular system kind of energy, and somebody who also has a kind of abundance, you know, if they're highly stressed, they will have a lot of energy. So CoQ10 is maybe best reserved for those low energy states. So findings of open label study of CoQ10 in a cohort of older adults with bipolar depression suggests that it may play a role in the treatment. And study results suggest specific symptoms such as lack of energy, sadness, and poor concentration may respond to such energy enhancing therapies. So we've got a study to show you at the end about that as well. So NADH is the active form of vitamin B3, which participates directly in the Krebs cycle. I have a few notes on NADH. So it's used in the production of ATP in the electron transport chain. It's found in every cell of the body. It's a cofactor for the Krebs cycle, and production declines with age. NADH in foods is found in the muscle tissue of fish, poultry, and beef, along with foods made with yeast. Obviously, your body will convert vitamin B3 to NADH in the body. And there's a relationship between NADH and cortisol. So Cortisone reductase, which is a bidirectional enzyme, catalyzes the conversion of cortisone to cortisol in the presence of NADH as a cofactor. And if levels of NADH are low, the enzyme catalyzes the reverse reaction from cortisol to cortisone. So NADH is basically a cofactor in that cortisol-cortisone bidirectional conversion. And so it acts as a kind of it ensures the homeostasis of cortisol levels, basically. So it's essential to the kind of maintenance of that. And so studies have been done, quite a few long-term studies have been done with NADH. So they show that for up to a year or more of continuous use, there haven't been any side effects with taking NADH. And it's also been studied with relation to depression. So not only anxiety and low energy states, but also depression. It also has been shown to improve the heart rate in chronic fatigue syndrome patients. Now, serine is an amino acid, and it's a precursor to tryptophan. It's also an antioxidant, and it has cytoprotective effects through the elevation of some antioxidant factors. Okay, so I won't look at this in too much detail because you will all know all of this, but these are just some food sources of some of the nutrients that we've talked through. So adaptogens. Now, adaptogens help us stay in the resistance phase longer, so that second phase when cortisol is high and DHEA is lowering. And this, I mean, here it says a stimulating effect, but it depends on the adaptogen. So some of them are stimulating and some of them are calming, but in general, they tend to bring your body into a state of equilibrium and increase the body's ability to cope with internal and external stresses. So most of them are non-addictive, I suppose. So you may need to take a short break after a certain amount of time, because sometimes the effects are reduced over time, and then you can overlap adaptogens or start a new adaptogen. And the majority of them have a really safe, good safety profile. So there are a few ginsengs. So American ginseng, also known as Panax ginseng, is really great for people who have low energy states, because it's very energy enhancing, and it can work similarly to caffeine. So people who are particularly sensitive to caffeine, I would maybe not recommend Panax ginseng to them, because it could be too stimulating. And also it's one that's best to be taken in the morning or in the afternoon, because otherwise it will disrupt sleep even more. Whereas Siberian ginseng is a non-stimulating ginseng, so it's much more calming. And this is the kind of adaptogen that could be used to help with sleep if somebody's particularly anxious, if on their adrenal salivary profile they have a peak before bed, or high cortisol before bed, then some of these calming anti-anxiety adaptogens might be good to introduce. Ashwagandha is becoming more and more well known, and it's also good with thyroid conditions, because it's shown to, I think in 1 or 2 studies, it's shown to increase the production of T3. So if somebody is suffering with thyroid suppression as well as stress, then that's a great one. Holy basil, turmeric and rhodiola are all really good adaptogens, and they tend to reduce physical and mental stress and increase the ability to cope with stress. With rhodiola, it's been shown to work on the hypothalamus to increase resistance to toxins and to stress. And studies have shown improvement in physical fitness, mental fatigue, and anti-fatigue effects in doctors on night shifts and army cadets. And so then we have some more herbs. So these are some great ones with very calming effects, and some of them have sedative effects. So these will often be found in maybe a sleep supplement or kind of sleep teas. So valerian, and the reason for that is that the majority of them are thought to work on either increasing the production of GABA, so that chief inhibitory neurotransmitter, or stimulating GABA receptors in the nervous system, and so mimicking the effect of GABA. So valerian is thought to increase the amount of GABA, and passion flower actually contains GABA. But I think passion flower also causes the increase in production of GABA in the brain. California poppy works in a similar way. And chamomile has been shown to treat insomnia, and again can be used as a sedative along with lemon balm. Lemon balm is also involved in GABA production. So obviously not everything is related to food. Somebody could have a perfect diet, taking all of the right supplements, but if they don't clean up their lifestyle and their daily routine, then they are going to find it difficult to make any lasting changes to their stress. So obviously do whatever you can to reduce the stresses if the stresses are within your control, reduce the reaction to the stress, retrain the circadian rhythm, and get as much sleep as possible and support sleep. So a lot of studies have focused on mindfulness and meditation, and whilst getting subjects to meditate, they've measured cortisol levels, and they found a significant decrease in cortisol levels just through meditation. So this study on the right here involves people with generalized anxiety disorder, and there's a control group, and mindfulness that involved 8 weeks of daily home practice, including breath awareness, a body scan, and gentle hatha yoga, found a reduction in adrenocorticotropic hormone. So there are quite a few studies that show this. So in terms of the cortisol awakening response, so this is partly automatically happens when you wake up, but part of it is caused by the reaction of light in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is in your pituitary gland. So this is, about 30 to 60 minutes after waking. And this suprachiasmatic nucleus, it's actually in the hypothalamus, not the pituitary, is responsible for controlling human circadian rhythm. So encouraging clients to either get full spectrum light from a light box or actual sunlight within an hour of waking up is a really good way of entraining the circadian rhythm and also improving that CAR, particularly if somebody's got a low one when you test them. Okay. So it's not only getting the right light in the morning, but it's also getting the right light in the evening. So this study looks at people reading e-readers. So, this could be any kind of electronic screen with blue light versus a paper book, and found that they produced 55% less melatonin. There was a delay of 1.5 hours, and therefore they took longer to fall asleep. They had less REM sleep when they were asleep, and obviously more sleepiness in the morning. So wherever possible, if people could not use blue light screens or wear blue light blocking glasses or put an app on their phones or computer, then that's likely to improve sleep, which has knock-on effects for the next day's circadian rhythm. A disrupted circadian rhythm can drive anxiety. Lots of studies show this. So research with people from childhood to young adulthood has shown that sleep disruption is significantly correlated with both state and trait anxiety, and poor sleep increases anxiety. A group derived of rapid eye movement sleep experienced significantly more anxiety in response to a stressful film than a group derived of non-REM sleep. So in addition to all of this, melatonin is a really powerful antioxidant and a growth hormone. So if they're not sleeping well and their circadian rhythm is dysfunctional, then they'll also be missing out on these antioxidant pathways from melatonin. So this is a summary: reduce stresses, reduce reaction to stress, do things that immediately convert you to your parasympathetic rest and digest, or feed and breed state. So not only meditation, but diaphragmatic breathing with long exhalations, laughter, any kind of oxytocin release, so being with loved ones and animals, and any kind of relaxation therapies. Even hearing laughter can increase parasympathetic nervous activity. And then retraining your circadian rhythm, so trying to get full spectrum light within half an hour of waking up. Avoid screens or use blue light blocking apps or glasses 2 hours before bed, and ensure it's totally pitch black when you are asleep, and get the hours in. So, okay, so this is the exciting bit, or interesting bit. So we've got the a couple of products to go through in some detail. So the first one is Calm 2, and this is a herbal blend of California poppy, or Eschscholtzia, I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing that right, valerian and passion flower. And so this, as the name suggests, is to promote anti-anxiety and calming states in clients. So this would be more for the high cortisol states and the high stress and high anxiety traits, as opposed to the kind of low energy ones. But it can also help with sleep if taken just before bed. So if anybody has any kind of sleep dysregulation, this is really helpful. So we've already been through a few of these adaptogens, but they basically all work on the GABA in the brain. So they will either increase GABA, or they'll work on the GABA receptors in the brain. Now, I'm going to go through that in a bit more detail, but just in terms of taking, so the recommendation is 1 capsule 3 times a day, tend to be before meals, but you can kind of increase or decrease based on when you're feeling most stressed. So for example, if somebody has a cortisol test where their cortisol is particularly high before bed and they're suffering from anxiety and that's affecting their sleep, then it would be good to take, 2 capsules before bed. Whereas if somebody has that, high cortisol, high stress state in the morning, then you could maybe increase the, or kind of get them to take the capsules in the morning or wherever that high cortisol peak is, and tailor it to the client in that way. All of the Vitae products are on Natural Dispensary, and there's also 40% off for practitioners on the Vitae website with the discount code practitioner, just FYI before I forget. So let's go through some of the ingredients. So this is California poppy, and it's a study that has shown that they act as stimulators, the alkaloids in California poppy act as stimulators of the binding of GABA-A receptor agonists in the brain, and they also work as anti-inflammatory agents. It's been used traditionally for a long time, mainly in North and South America, and it's known for its sedative, anxiolytic, and anti-anxiety effects. They've also been shown potentially to have an affinity with benzodiazepine receptors, which also promote calming states. Okay, so then we've got passion flower. So this is, again, another traditional herbal sedative, an anxiolytic, and it's also a popular sleep aid. The way that these tend to work isn't so much kind of over sedation, it's more reducing anxiety. So if somebody has issues with sleeping and it's relating to anxiety, then these are some great herbs to incorporate. So this study here looked at 41 participants, and it was a placebo-controlled style trial, and it was actually in the form of a tea and a sleep diary, but sleep quality showed a significantly better rating for passion flower compared with placebo. And again, passion flower works on the GABA A receptors, and animal behavioral models have shown non-sedative anti-anxiety effects. Okay, so we've got another study here on passion flower, and this was a supplement, 500 milligrams of a passion flower supplement, and it showed that this was actually before surgery, and the number rating scale anxiety scores were significantly lower in the passion flower group. And valerian. So valerian is obviously one of the most kind of commonly thought of herbs when it comes to sleep. And it's thought to enhance the signaling of GABA. And it's also thought to potentially aid with menstrual pain because it's an anti-spasmodic herb. Now, a study's shown that it reduces sleep latency and improves sleep quality in a randomized controlled trial with those having chemotherapy, and it showed a statistically significant effect on improvement of sleep within 16 studies. So that's this review here. Now, the second product is Reconnect. So this is more focused for the low energy states. So this particular product has been used in a number of clinical trials with people who have chronic fatigue syndrome. So we'll go through those in a minute. But just for now, so the ingredients: coenzyme Q10, vitamin C, serine, and NADH. Now, let me just check my notes to give you a bit more detail about this. So we've been through coenzyme Q10. So this contributes to more than 90% of the ATP in the body, since it's essential for the process of cellular respiration, and it's a really powerful antioxidant. So Reconnect is recommended for mental and physical performance. So not just for people with chronic fatigue syndrome. Obviously, this is kind of an extreme low energy state, but a lot of athletes will use this for energy production. And again, you can tailor the dosage throughout the day. So because this is typically very energy producing, it might be good to take in the morning and afternoon rather than the evening if people are sensitive in terms of sleep. And so we've got a couple of studies here. So let's go on to the next one, actually. So the study includes vitamin C, and as we were talking before, any kind of increase in stress and increase in stress hormones, including cortisol, will cause the excretion of vitamin C. So this study showed that hormone-regulated vitamin secretion occurs, and the adrenal vitamin C secretion is part of the stress response. So we need to replace that lost vitamin C in food and supplement in somebody who is chronically stressed. Now, this study is actually using 4 capsules of the Reconnect product. So this works out as 200 milligrams of CoQ10 and 20 milligrams of NADH. And this looked at 73 Spanish chronic fatigue syndrome patients, and a significant improvement of fatigue was shown due to the fatigue total score reducing, and a recovery of the biochemical parameters. So so this showed that fatigue scores significantly improved. And obviously chronic fatigue syndrome is a kind of multifactorial condition itself, but it's thought to have links with hypoadrenal function, at least in some cases, so any low energy condition. This is the same product and the same dosage. So again, I think we've got 200 milligrams let's say it here, 200 milligrams CoQ10 and 20 milligrams NADH for 8 weeks. And this study found a reduction in the max heart rate and a reduction of fatigue. So obviously a lower heart rate is preferable because it shows a healthy cardiovascular system, and it shows that the heart can respond to routine stresses more efficiently. So having a low heart rate is a significant contribution to overall health as opposed to it being excessively high. Now, we have a couple of case studies here. So this is a case study of a 43-year-old woman who on her annual visit had abdominal pain after meals and constipation and midnight wakening. And she is using laxatives, and these improve her intestinal transit. She has a very high stress job, is under a lot of stress and pressure, and her her levels of cortisol have been shown to be high, and she has low enzymes and also a parasite infection. So obviously the treatment is an antiparasitic, a product which is called Magvita, and this is a combination of 6 different forms of magnesium salts and vitamin B6 and taurine. So this is for energy and sleep quality, taken in the morning and in the evening. Reconnect, which is the CoQ10 and NADH vitamin C supplement, and this is for stress management and energy supply during the day. So typically this is taken in the morning and the afternoon, and with her she's having 2 in the morning. And then Calm Chew calms the nervous system during the day, so at night she can have a more balanced and restful sleep. And she's having 2 of these in the evening and 2 throughout the day. And so 6 months later, the outcome was no abdominal pain, regular intestinal transit, no midnight wakening. So in a lot of cortisol and fatigue states, it does take a long time to see an improvement, and they tend to be gradual rather than sudden and dramatic. So it can be months. If somebody's been in a high stress state for a while, it can even be years. Okay, so let's look at the second case study here. So this is a 58-year-old woman. She's been diagnosed with depression. She's taking antidepressants and sleep inducers, and she has low energy in the morning, tiredness, back pain, low mood, constipation, reflux. So there's quite a lot of digestive symptoms with her. Low cortisol upon testing due to the sustained stress, and she's also got quite poor nutrition. So the treatment was amino acids, so a protein blend, Magvita again, so that's 6 magnesium salts, B6 and taurine, which improves energy and sleep quality. Then we've got Reconnect, so we've got 2 taken throughout the day, so 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon. And again, this is for energy supply during the day, reducing exhaustion at night, really trying to recalibrate that circadian rhythm and better sleep quality, and then 2 Calm Chew at night. So this is calming the nervous system during the day, so at night it's more balanced and she can have a more restful sleep. Nutritional advice to improve her nutritional status, and just 2 months later she's still feeling tired, but after 2 p.m. And the morning is okay. So sometimes this will happen, and it will be kind of a gradual improvement, and whichever part of the day is kind of more dysregulated, that will you'll see improvements more so at that time if you redo your adrenal salivary test. She stopped the antidepressant and also the sleep inducer. Just a note on the contraindications. So both Reconnect and Calm Chew are fine to take with HRT. Reconnect is fine to take with antidepressants. Calm Chew we would usually recommend against taking with antidepressants because it could have a potentially additive effect. However, if you're working with a doctor or healthcare practitioner, you could reduce your antidepressants and then start to take Calm Chew in that way. And I think those are the main ones in terms of medications. So that is the end of the presentation.